Hello and welcome to What's on My Mind with Fiona. I apologise. I've been away for a couple of months. I'm back into it now. What an interesting couple of months it has been. So, look, I'm really excited. I'm really happy that Trump got in. So far, I've been loving everything he's done. So, I know, look, there's no politician that's going to do everything perfectly and you're going to love everything that they do, whether that's Australian politics, US politics, wherever. However, so far, it's been great. It's so good to finally see a leader who is being a leader, who is being strong, and who is sticking up for his country and his people. So I'm really loving it. I was just listening to a podcast with some of the people involved in MAHA, so the Make America Healthy Again, and I'm really interested in seeing where that goes as well, because for those of you who don't know, I do have another podcast called The Wellness Connection, and I am a nutritionist, and so I'm excited to see what's happening there. I know that it's the US, not Australia, but what I find is that we copy a lot of things that they do over there. So, and we copy all of the stuff that doesn't go so well. So I'm hoping we'll copy some of the stuff that does go well. And of course, if they start looking more into, I know that what they're interested in doing is looking into things like, you know, they're looking at vaccines, right? And they're not just like canceling them all and getting rid of them all. And some of them are really great, but they're saying, do kids need whatever it is, 70 odd vaccines? Do they, don't they? And can we space them out more? Or is there, like, for example, Hep B? Hep B is a either sexually transmitted or drug utensil, like syringe transferred disease, and unless you're maybe born in a high risk situation, or if your mother has it, then why you don't need it? As why does a newborn baby need it? So just looking at that, so not being anti-vax, just saying, hey, look, let's look at realistically at the schedule. And one of the good things about that actually is, just to put in perspective again, I'm not sort of pro or anti-vax. I just think as science, just look at what works and what doesn't, and it's okay to question or to have conversations, right? We need to be able to have conversations about stuff, which is what I'm excited about this. And I've heard some people sort of say, "Oh, well, it's no good because they're arguing with each other, the team." And I think it's great. I think it's great because if you have people on your own team who are prepared to argue with you, you come. Hopefully, that means you come up with better ideas. And I'd rather that than a team like we had in the Biden administration, where no one was allowed to say anything and everyone just agreed and smiled and said that the man with dementia who couldn't stand up knew what he was doing. So I'd rather Trump have a team of people who have robust conversations and argue over different things and clarify things, because I think generally things work out better when you are able to have robust arguments, you're able to look at the science, you're able to have discussions and work things through. So I got no problem with that. But yeah, in regards to the vaccines, one of the issues that in the United States is that I think it was when Reagan was in, I think he changed it so that essentially the vaccine companies are not held liable, sort of thing. And so for that reason, like the drug companies, and I think the government has a fund that helps pay people if they have vaccine injuries and things, but the companies are sort of free, sort of thing. Doesn't matter what happens. They're not responsible for vaccine injuries and things. More recently with the COVID vaccine, that was the case, certainly in Australia as well. I'm pretty sure that the Australian government said that they'd to get it in a hurry. They just said, "Oh, look, don't worry, you won't be held responsible for anything." Right? The problem when you do that with companies who are about making money is that then they're going to try and get as many vaccines in as they can, which is what they've done. And in the US, I think now that 6-month-olds are supposed to be having the COVID vaccine, that's ridiculous. The evidence for it being beneficial for young people, anyone under the age of 30, sort of thing, is very limited. Actually, it's quite the opposite. That it's the risk for those people, and it's and for babies, don't be ridiculous, So yeah, its problem is it encourages them to do more because they can, because they, you know, they're not held responsible. So I think there's nothing wrong with questioning it. Not anti-vax. I think that some of them really have their place, and I'm glad that we have them. And I had a needle stick injury at a job I was in once, and the first thing I did was go to my GP and get a vaccination. So not against it. but you've got to make sure that the science is there, and you've got to give the vaccines to the people who are the right person and who need it, and not the people who don't need it. And you also just have to assess things like science. I think in that podcast I was listening to, I think was it Casey Means, who's part of the sort of MAHA team, the Make America Healthy Again team. He was saying that at the moment with the FDA, 50% of drugs are drugs that have been passed through the FDA and approved. 50% of their studies, they can't be replicated. So when they try and replicate the study that the drug company did to say that this drug works, they can't replicate it. So in other words, that the drug company got a study to work once in their favor, and they weren't able to replicate that to prove it again. So it's very kind of flimsy science. One study says it works, we'll just stop there, and we just won't. When all the following studies say it doesn't work, let's just not worry about that, right? So that's kind of how these things work. So I'm glad for that. Look, I am also, as you would probably be aware, so happy that Trump has come down on this gender ideology. Look, he said that there's only two genders. I don't like that language so much anymore. I prefer to say two sexes. And I'm pretty sure in his executive order it actually did say that. But the problem with using the word gender these days is like, look, it used to just be obviously sex and gender. We saw it as the same thing. And gender was a nicer way of saying sex, because sex is also an act, not just a biological fact, right? But the problem is now that gender has been stolen by the activists, and it's sort of become a different word. Well, it hasn't. It's the same thing. But anyway, in their books, it has changed. And so I think things get a bit confused when you use that word, because they use it as, whatever you feel like, blah, blah, blah. So I prefer to use the word sex. So there's two sexes. And I think that is brilliant. And also just things like he's removing gender ideology from the schools, and banning it around the country for minors, right? And there's been this whole, like, it's actually been quite hilarious to watch the I still don't understand. I see like my friends on online kind of going, "Oh my God, Trump's in. Are you okay? Oh, are you okay? Oh, it's so bad. Oh my God." Like, he's just been hitting it out of the park, doing great things, helping his country and helping his. I don't see the problem. But one of the things I've seen is that, you know, again, it's like, oh, they say I don't exist now for people who class themselves as being, you know, non-binary or trans or whatever. It's not a question of whether or not you exist. Obviously, you're an individual, you're a human being, you exist. The thing isn't about existing. It's actually about whether or not you can just be who you want to be. It's fine, no problem. And you demanding that I change everything to help you out, to basically give up my rights as a woman, to include you in women's spaces, that I am compelled to call you she if you're a man or whatever, that that you are allowed to just say, oh, I'm a woman, and ending up in all of the women only spaces and women's sports and all of that sort of stuff. So no one's stopped you from existing. You still exist. They've just said you can exist, but I don't have to buy into it. Right? I don't have to. You don't need me to affirm you for you to be okay. If you do, then maybe you have a mental health issue, and maybe you should explore that. Right? So that is a good thing, and no one's been destroyed, and he's not lining people up on the street shooting. You think he's lining people up on the street shooting them or something? It's so ridiculous. And Selena Gomez crying because they're sending murderers back to their countries that they come from. A fair income. Come and find something to cry about, like the people who are being harmed and injured by some of the illegals. Look, and I shouldn't have to say this, but obviously people in every country and people who are from like Australians harm people, and it's terrible. But then if someone who's come to Australia and who's not originally from Australia harms someone, well, then they should go home, right? Because we've got enough of our own to deal with without dealing with imports of violence, right? So it's as simple as that. So it's not saying that people from a certain country, like if you're native to Britain, or if you're native to Australia, or if you're native to the US or whatever, that you can't do anything wrong and it's only illegals who do it. Of course not. It's just saying, hey, look, there's enough problems in a society with people who do the wrong thing. No one is looking to import that, right? That's all it is. So as simple as that. So, great. Great. I'm so glad of that. And I think that in the Western world, we need to save our values, and we need to save this Western world. And there's a lot of good things about it. I've talked about it in the past. There's bad things as well, but you can look at our history and you can look at what we've done, and you can just be really, really honest about it. But overall, on balance, I think we've done more good things than bad. And, and you only have to prove that point, you only have to look at which way the traffic is going, right? So when people wanting to leave their countries and go to another country, where do they go to? They're going to Australia, they're going through to the UK, and they're going to the US. A lot of these people, they go through other countries to get here. Like, I mean, you can't directly just, like, Australia is an island. And like in, say, the UK, they're often going via France or other countries, right? So they go through other countries where it's safe, and they would be safe to get to these countries. So they're not going to the countries because some people are real asylum seekers and they're really in trouble and blah blah blah, and they deserve support and help and all that sort of stuff. But most of these people are just doing it because it's better than where they are, right? And I understand that, but problem is, if you let everyone come into the Western world, then everywhere ends up being awful, right? Whereas what you can do is keep a certain level of living standards in the Western world, and support some people to immigrate and to be part of that, which is amazing. But just not let them bring all their problems here, because what happens is, if people, if it's kind of slow, if it's slow and people drip into a society, then what happens is they integrate, and you can get some great things from their culture, but they also integrate and they want to be part of our culture, and they want to be here because of the freedoms and because of the freedom of speech and because of all of those wonderful things that we have. But when you have millions of people show up, then what happens is there's no integration, and what we're having now in around the world, you're seeing it's a huge issue in places like Sweden, where there's a whole bunch of no-go zones that was never like that before. Is we're getting many people from places who are just bringing their wars with them, and bringing their fights with them, and bringing their trauma with them, and just inflicting it on our society, and that's not what we want. So we want to, if our societies were all so terrible, or why are they all trying to come here? And why aren't there people lined up to get into Guatemala or Mexico or, or China or wherever? They're not, right? That's because we actually have a better, where we do better in the Western world. Are we perfect? No, but we do better. And that sort of continues on to in Australia. We just recently had Australia Day, and it's just like every year there's this big fight about Australia Day, and actually it's getting less now, which is good. But there's this whole host of people that sort of say it's evil and bad, and it's racist, and it's all this white supremacist and all this other stuff. And really, it's just, look, there's people who are permanent sort of grievance people, who just love to complain about stuff, and who love to have grievances, and who love to play victim or find people to play victim. And what they do here, and Australia Day isn't a celebration of the day that Captain Cook arrived or whatever. It's actually a celebration of the day that Australia actually became a country, as opposed to just an outpost of Britain. It became a country on its own, which I think is in 1949 or something. So that's what it's about. So Australia actually became an actual country then, as opposed to just like an outpost, and which is great to celebrate. And of course, we can and we do celebrate all aspects of Australian culture. So we can celebrate the Indigenous culture and all the great things about that, and we can also celebrate all the good things that have come along since then, and all the good things that the British brought along. Now, you can go on and on about colonisation, but if the Brits didn't colonise here, the Dutch would have, or the French would have, or somebody else would have, right? 5 minutes later, someone else would have been here. It just is what it is. It's around the world, that's just what has happened. And you can go on about it as much as you like, but that's what's happened. That's where we're at. So, but these grievance activists just want to be angry all the time and don't sort of want to move forward. And what they want to do is they actually want to make it's in their interests to essentially make the Indigenous population unhappy. And, the other thing too is that they were always talking about closing the gap. Um, and closing the gap in Australia, what that means essentially is that there are, especially in sort of people who live in the outback. So in outback communities, there are really big differences between health outcomes and education outcomes and life outcomes, and we do need to close the gap so that basically that the Indigenous population have are brought up to the standard of the population of the European settlers, whatever, whites, whatever you want to call it, because obviously not everyone's white. It's quite a mixed country, but just the other people in Australia. That's a good thing. We want to do that. Essentially, though, they want to do it by funding a whole bunch of money and just pouring a whole bunch of money into the situation, which we've been doing forever. It doesn't work. And they also want to do it by just telling everybody and telling the Indigenous community that everyone hates them, that they're discriminated against, and there's all this stuff that you have in the United States too, where they're talking about you know what do they call it, systemic. Systemic racism and all that kind of stuff, and so all they want to do is disempower people and tell them that they're hard done by. It's really bad. We'll just throw a whole bunch of money at the situation because, of course, that's going to fix it. But what we don't do, and what we also do in Australia and in other places, is we don't. I think it's called like cultural relativism. Yeah, I think that's what it's called. I don't know. We're not quite getting it. But essentially, what we do is we say that all cultures are equal. So we say that, okay, a culture where, say in the Western world where women, well, I'll talk about the women thing a bit more in a minute, but anyway, essentially, in more recent times, women have the vote, women, I could be in management position, women, have been prime minister or whatever, and one day that I'm sure there will be a female president in the US when there's a good one to be there. So far, there hasn't been great options, but when there is one, there will be one. But, women are treated equally and have equal rights and all of that kind of stuff, right? So we've got that, and it's illegal to rape a woman or sexually assault a woman or murder someone or whatever, and things like domestic violence is considered like it's still an issue. It's a big issue, I'm sure, in all around the world, but it is also frowned upon and illegal, right? So, and we've got put in strategies to help people get out of domestic violence situations. And it's not all women, by the way, that happens sort of both ways, and women to women and all the rest of it. But so we've got all of that kind of stuff here, and we're saying, oh, that's equal to a society where they do female genital mutilation. Although we do that now with trans ideology, so that's interesting that we can't really be I think we're morally superior from that point of view. And that, so societies where they push people off a roof because they're gay, hang them because they're gay, make women wear those ridiculous things where they can't even, is it the burqa? I get confused with, or niqab, I can't remember now. But the one basically where they can barely see and you can only see their eyes, they're not allowed to speak. So they're not even allowed to have their speaking voice heard. What, that's equivalent to our culture? No, it's not. So I think it's cultural relativism, I think it's called. And the new thing is to say, oh, we're all the same and all cultures are equal. No, they're not. A culture that sort of stones a woman to death for being raped is not equal. And the same goes in Australia. And I get hell for saying this, but in Australia, and I listened to Jacinta Nampijinpa Price on this, and she is an Australian politician who is half sort of Celtic background and half Aboriginal background, and she's grown up in these Aboriginal communities, so she knows a lot more about them than what I do. But she was explaining, the cultural, what do they call it? Cultural law. I can't remember what it's called. I think it's some name like that. Anyway, they have, there's an Indigenous law. And Indigenous laws allow men to spear women in the leg. right? And it's still legal now for them to do that, right? For just it doesn't have to be a good reason. It's just like she's misbehaved, right? Or she's come across a men's group that she shouldn't have, or whatever. So that's actually legal. Like that's not an equivalent thing, right? That is not an equivalent cultural thing. That's not good. That's not okay. If if my husband did that to me, it would be, an outrage, as it should be. But in an Indigenous community, if a man does it to his wife, no one says anything because that's their culture, and their culture is just as good as ours. Well, like, not in that regard, it's not. And I've talked about this before. It's not about everyone thinking they're better than everyone else. Like if there's great things about cultures, let's have that. And certainly there is great art in the Aboriginal culture. There's different stories, the dreaming, dream time, whatever. Some of that sounds, some of that's it's ridiculous when they use it to whether or not they approve of mine or something. But that's there, and there's probably some. I imagine there's a lot of depth and beauty to that. Great, good, and there's obviously that the Indigenous culture in Australia knew a lot about the land and knew a lot about uh, like things like fire management, those kinds of things. As far as they knew how to manage things like that for safety and whatever. So there's a lot of things, and I'm sure more things that I'm not naming off the top of my head. There are great things that can and do. Oh, and bush tucker, right? Bush tucker and medicine, whatever. So they're great things that come out of the Indigenous culture of Australia. Great. Let's know about those things. Let's learn about those things. Wonderful. There are terrible things that come out of that culture as well. And the way they treat women is one of them, and the way they treat children. Now, I don't have the stats in front of me, but the risk, I think, for women in those situations, in those communities, there's something like 30 or 40 times a higher chance of being attacked, being assaulted by their husbands or by someone in their community. And they're doing this to their own community. And I don't have the stats in front of me as well, but there's a huge problem with children being, I won't say all the language because of many YouTube issues, but harmed in grievous ways. And yes, of course, that still happens in other parts of society, and I'm not saying it doesn't happen outside of there in the cities with people of all different colours and races and stuff. Of course, unfortunately, it does, but there's a very concentrated and very high level of it happening in some of these communities. So the solution isn't just to throw money at these things. Obviously, there needs to be a bigger solution, and part of that is not saying, because instead of like marching for, say, do Black Lives Matter and marching for the Indigenous man who is spearing his wife in the leg and harming small children, because that's what they were marching for when they were doing the Black Lives Matter march here. They were marching for men who were imprisoned. Well, they are imprisoned for a reason. Let's march for the women and the children, and let's support the women and the children and the men who aren't involved in that horrific stuff, and the men who are supporting and caring for their partners and their children. So there's something. All cultures have their good and bad in them. So rather than lionizing one culture and seeing it as wonderful and beautiful and perfect, and demonizing the other, let's just kind of get the best from them. And rather than going on about and the Australia Day thing, if I truly believed that if all we had to do was change the date of Australia Day, and that would make everything better for Aboriginal culture, for the Indigenous people of Australia, that would make like all the Aboriginal people are so upset about Australia Day, I had a boyfriend who was Aboriginal many years ago. He's passed since, but he was a big fan of Australia Day. He loved it, right? So it's not all, but let's just say if all Aboriginal people felt this way, and if changing the date would just sort things out, calm things down, everyone would be happy. Then we could all just celebrate Australia and being all and let us all be Australians. If I thought that was how it would work out, I would support changing the date. However, when you talk to these activists are not interested in changing the date. What they want to do is they're ashamed about Australia altogether. They want to destroy what we have here. And they do that. And then they do that that always was, always will be, right, in regards to its native land, its Indigenous lands. Well, that's just really rude to everybody who's come since, because I'm sort of third or fourth generation or whatever. There are new Australians coming all the time from different countries. It's their country too, it's my country too, it's all of our countries. So let's just forget all of that. It's hundreds of years ago, right? Acknowledge what we did wrong, absolutely. Support people to do better and get out of poverty and whatever's going on for them, absolutely. But just spend all of our time trying to destroy, because it's just a Marxist agenda to destroy Australia. Because when you talk to them, they say it's not about the date, it's actually about the fact that I don't want to celebrate being Australian. I'm ashamed of being Australian and I want to tear it all down. So, because that's what's behind it, I'm not interested in changing anything. And I don't, and I think that what happens is all of these activists with agendas, they just want to get lots of funding for all of their pet projects. And what they do is they use, whether they use the trans community or whether they use the Indigenous community, whoever it is, they just use them as pawns to get their funding. They want a constant agenda of grievance, and they're not actually interested in resolving the problems for these peoples that they say they want to resolve the problems for. But it is in their interest to keep these communities angry and unhappy, because then they keep getting funding for their pet projects. So just the other thing is to look where the money goes, look at the people who make money off of these things, because that's the issue I have, is the grievance agenda, rather than people wanting actual unity and wanting to work together and wanting to really make things better. Because so much is about seeming to care and seeming to do the right thing rather than doing the right thing. They're two different things. And at the moment, look, there's been times in my life I've supported the left, and the left have been great. Times in my life I haven't. But at the moment, I'm appalled by the left, because the left is only about seeming, only about saying the right words. If we say words like compassion and unity, it just happens magically, but it doesn't. Whereas what you can see what Trump's doing at the moment is about unity. He's actually doing great things and making people feel good about who they are, feel good about their country, and making people equal, and that brilliant. And that's what we should be doing more of in Australia. So I hope we start copying some of that stuff. Just ending, because I've sort of ranted for a long enough, first time back in a while. I just wanted to also just acknowledge or talk about some of the changes that have happened in Australia in regards to the gender stuff. That certainly in Queensland, they have announced I think an independent review and they've kind of stopped doing puberty blockers and things for underage, for children. And well, unfortunately, they haven't stopped doing it for ones who are already on it, but they've stopped doing it for anyone new. And they're doing some sort of review, which is good news. Not exactly what you want to hear, but heading in the right direction. But then what happened is the Australian government, who is a Labor left government, the Queensland government's not. The Queensland government's now Conservative. So the Labor government the Australian federal government have now said they're doing, well, they sort of, I can't remember if they called it a review or what they called it, but theirs seems to be a bit different. So they are kind of actually praising the current guidelines and saying they want to just bring the states in together in alignment, and so and apparently they've been trying to stop the review in Queensland. So I think the Australian one that Albanese, our Prime Minister, has announced, I think it's, look, I'd like to think it's going to be a proper independent review, and finally it's the end of this stuff. And why do we copy all the bad things that happen overseas and don't look at when people change it in Australia? It's changed in Europe. In Northern Europe, they've said wrong way, go back. And in America, they're changing it. And in the UK, they've changed it. They did the CAS review and they know that it's not good for children and it's not the solution for children. In Australia, we're still going forward with it. Why don't we just look at what they're doing? Anyway, I would like to think that they're going to do a review and they're going to learn and they're going to stop it. What I do think is going to happen, though, is I think there's a federal election going to be coming up in Australia sometime in the next 8 weeks or so. And I think that it's Labor's way of pretending that they're doing something when they're not really. Because I think it looks like a lot of people involved in this review are activists who are all for the agenda of the trans agenda, this agenda for children. And it looks to me like it's a way to put off the Queensland study or stop it altogether, and to do a study that just confirms that they all know that they were right in the first place, because they're such wonderful, caring, compassionate people and they're all about helping the kids. by mutilating them or by giving them medications that damage their bodies permanently. Um, and I have a feeling that it's more about the agenda for the election, to get them through the election. So it'll be conveniently put off until after the election, so that it's like, oh, we're doing something, seeming but not doing, right? So I think it's another example of seeming but not doing. I hope I'm wrong. I really hope I'm wrong, but that's what it looks like it is at this point in time. Anyway, I will leave it there. It's good to be back, and anyway, I'd love to hear your opinion. As long as you can be decent in how you express it, I'm fine with having robust conversations, just in good faith and not abusive. Otherwise, I just don't engage. Anyway, I hope you have a good week, and I will talk to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.